As the final episode of Star Trek The Next Generation put it, all good things must come to an end. And it's true. Whether it's the end of a TV show you like, a band that you like splitting up or retiring, or the end of a sporting dominance, all good things come to an end. And there's been plenty of that. Rafa Nadal and Roger Federer retiring from tennis, the end of TV shows like The Wire, Spooks and Peaky Blinders, and also the retirement of Wayne Gretzky from hockey, to name quite literally some. And the same can be said for motorsport, because Williams' dominance in the 1990s came to an end just as the team switched colours. So it was always sort of a, is it connected to this, and bits and pieces like that. But the colour switch also got everybody watching TV at the time wondering the same thing. Is that Williams, or is it Ferrari? I can't tell. Williams had enjoyed a lot of front-running success starting around the 1980s. Alan Jones had won them their first world title before Keke Rosberg emerged triumphant in 1982, although that title does carry a black shadow around with it, given that 1982 was the year that Gilles Villeneuve and Riccardo Paletti were killed, and Didier Pironi saw his F1 career end with a huge shunt at the German Grand Prix. On top of this, there was also the water-cooled brakes row in Brazil, and the fallout surrounding the FISA-FOCA war that saw several teams, including Williams, boycott the San Marino Grand Prix. It was almost the season nobody wanted to win, and Nigel Roebuck had described it as an ugly year, pockmarked with tragedy, dissension, greed that also, paradoxically, produced some of the most memorable racing ever seen. Now Rosberg, who won that title, won just one race all season, the Swiss Grand Prix at Dijon. Now geography enthusiasts will be quick to say that Dijon is in France and not in Switzerland. Correct. It's one of those instances where they had two Grand Prix in the same country and one had to take on another name, much like the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola and the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. So the French Grand Prix was at Paul Ricard, the Swiss Grand Prix at Dijon. The more you know. And as a bonus fun fact, Williams had actually finished 4th in the Constructors that year, which I think means it's the lowest Constructors finish for a Drivers' World Champion, if you follow me. So Williams had a Drivers' and Constructors double in 1980, a Constructors title in 1981, a Drivers' in 82, and was simultaneously 4th and 11th in the Constructors in 83. That's because the FW09 was introduced for the final round in South Africa, and it was using a Honda Turbo instead of the Ford DFV that they'd been using for the rest of the season, so they were scored separately for each entry. Williams Ford had 36 points at the end of that season, Williams Honda had 2. There were seasons of the 80s where a 6th in 84 and a 7th in 88. By the end of the 80s and into the start of the 90s, things had picked up a bit, but they were still behind the McLarens, particularly of Senna and Prost. We talked about things picking up in the video at the start of this week, talking about Mansell's FW14, so I won't bore you with all the details. Williams managed to jump on the flappy paddle sequential gearbox bandwagon, and had also scored the services of a young Adrian Newey to join Patrick Head's design team. The gifted Newey, working with Head, produced the oh-so-near FW14, the championship-winning FW14B, another championship-winning FW15C, and then another Constructors winner in the FW16, which also came close to a Drivers' Championship in a year that had so much happening. I've covered pretty much all of it by now in separate issues of this series. Schumacher's band really helped them out that year, to be honest. 1995, though, was a disaster. Hill and Williams threw it away, but they bounced back in 1996 with one of my favourite F1 cars of all time, the FW18. The following year they had a less easy time of things, as Ferrari was on the way back, and the championship was fought between Schumacher and Villeneuve. But Williams came out the other side with another Drivers' and Constructors double, meaning they'd won the Constructors in 1992, 3, 4, 6 and 7. This causes some confusion because I've mentioned this stat before, and there's always somebody that says that Benetton won 1994. Benetton won 1995, but Williams got the Constructors in 94 while Schumacher got the Drivers. See also 1999 when Ferrari got the Constructors but Hakkinen won the Drivers, and so on. But behind the scenes at Williams, things were starting to unravel because of, well, infighting and also manufacturer withdrawal. At the end of 1996, Adrian Newey left the team to go on gardening leave. He'd taken the opportunity to go to McLaren. Various fallouts had been occurring between Newey and the top bods, Frank Williams and Patrick Head, as early as the latter part of 1992, when Newey was displeased that the team had signed Alain Prost and effectively shoved Mansell out the door. Williams was able to sign a new deal with Newey in 1993, and one of the clauses in his contract was he'd get a say in driver selection discussions. In 1995, Newey signed another extension where he'd be consulted on everything from drivers to engines and whatever was going on with the FIA. As he wrote in How to Build a Car, there were going to be no more decisions being made over lunch for him to learn about much later. But in the summer of 1995, Canadian kart racer Jacques Villeneuve was given a test with Williams. Frank and Patrick said he needed to get within a second of Damon to be in consideration for another invite to test. Villeneuve got within a second of Damon, and Williams signed Villeneuve for 1996, without talking to Newey, who was on holiday at the time. Frank assured Adrian that he was sorry, and the two moved on and got back to work, but at the end of 1995, Hill had been utterly destroyed by Schumacher, so at the beginning of 1996, Frank signed Heinz-Harald Frentzen without Newey knowing. So at the end of 1996, Hill would be surplus to requirements, and then in 1997, the Williams lineup would be JV and Heinz-Harald, and Adrian was not happy with this. And not only was Adrian being shafted on the contract front, with Williams and Head ignoring the terms of that contract out of habit because they were just very set in their ways, Newey was also a bit miffed that there was going to be no career progression at Williams. The operation was Frank Williams and Patrick Head. Frank owned 70% of the team and Head 30% of the team. With the guy in the top engineering job being one of the shareholders, there was going to be a huge problem getting any further up the ladder and being in a position of creative control over the cars that were being designed. Frank was also not keen on letting Adrian become a shareholder either. Newey wanted out. Frank said his contract was until 1999. Newey said that Frank had breached that contract multiple times. This would have resulted in a legal battle, and Newey was advised to take some time away from the team because suing for breach of contract and continuing to work wouldn't be good for his case. So he started his new job at McLaren in the August of 1997. So Williams had lost their cheat code designer. They were also on the edge of losing their cheat code engines as well. Renault was probably the most successful engine supplier of the 90s. A Renault-powered car had won the championship every year from 1992 to 1996 and was about to win again in 1997. But Renault was on their way out of the sport, and the finale of the 1997 season was negotiated by Renault with Bernie so that their final race in Formula 1 would be in Europe. As it was, Williams won the Constructors' Championship and Renault was able to leave on a high. The two teams that used the engines at that time, Williams and Benetton, would be on the hunt for new engine suppliers. If anything, Renault had been too successful in Formula 1. The company was suffering from diminishing returns, and the only time the company was being mentioned was when it wasn't winning. And economically, it wasn't working too well for them either. The franc, France's currency before the euro, wasn't performing too well against other currencies, so selling goods outside of the European Union wasn't going too well. The company had also been privatised as part of Jacques Chirac's new government, and when a company is privatised, only shareholders and their dividends matter. Renault had also considered entering into kart as an engine supplier, which would have improved their standing in South America, while also being a lot cheaper than Formula 1. Peugeot was apparently licking its lips over this, because they could poach all of Renault's laid-off staff and make their engines better. Yeah, that didn't happen. So with Newey and Renault out, the Williams team was a little stuck through 1997. Before leaving, Newey was able to finish off the FW19 that would win the championship, and that was as good as it would get for the team in blue and white. As F1 entered 1998, big rule changes were afoot, as F1 was about to enter the groove tyre and narrow track era. The cars got narrower and 3 grooves were cut into the front tyres while 4 were cut into the rear to reduce the contact patch on the road and reduce grip. This was in response to braking distances and lap times being reduced massively in 1997, as the tyre war had begun between Bridgestone and Goodyear. Goodyear would later pull out at the end of 1998 as they felt the grooves were counterproductive to their aims of producing the world's best racing tyres, which left Bridgestone the only supplier for 1999. Newey's job for the 1998 car had been taken over by Gavin Fisher, and the end result for the team was that the car was, cosmetically, very similar to what came before. Newey, meanwhile, over at McLaren had managed to work some magic with the side pods, sculpting the leading edges in such a way that they coped with the tyre wake that was now much more inwards than it used to be. I'm looking at pictures of the two cars side by side and I can't tell the difference between them in terms of side pod design. There's nothing radical on the McLaren versus the Williams, so I'm just going to have to take the internet's word for it here. The engine, meanwhile, was pretty much the same as it was in 1997. The Renault RS9 was now the Mechachrome GC37 that only had about 15 horsepower more than it had before, while Mercedes and Ferrari had brought all new engines with 5 or 10 horsepower more on top of that. The Mechachrome had around 770 horsepower, the Mercedes 780, and the Ferrari had around 800. So the Williams was not only let down aerodynamically, but mechanically as well. And shall we address the other part about this 1998 Williams? It was red. From 1984 up until the end of 1997, the Williams cars were some sort of blue and white, and yellow as well for other sponsorship reasons. But in 1994 they brought the iconic Rothmans tobacco colours that have been used on rally cars, sports cars and motorbikes as well. And on Newey's cars in 1995, 6 and 7 they just looked right. I'm not a, ooh, look at that livery, that's a pretty car person, and, picking the liveries apart like people are going to be doing over the next month and a half when the new 2024 cars are revealed, but it just looked right on that shape. It's a rare time a beautiful looking colour scheme translates to a competitive car. But in 1998, Rothmans decided they wanted to promote another brand of Siggy's, deciding on promoting their Winfield brand that is sold in Australia, making the car look more like the Nissan GTRs that were in Australian touring cars in 1992. And on the crappy TVs of the time over here, they look like Ferraris. Remember, HD didn't exist back then. There was no 1080i, only 480p. The change was not received well by the motorsport public. Williams cars were blue and white. They were Rothmans. Rothmans was Williams and Williams was Rothmans. That was the winning combo. Now they're red and they've got Woody Woodpecker painted on the nose cone. If Woody Woodpecker had been painted onto the nose cone of a car today, it would be a meme. But the colour was the least of Williams' concerns. They'd gone too conservative with the car design and it was too similar to the previous year's car. The underpowered engine meant that they had a disadvantage at a lot of tracks, and while Frentzen was third at the season opening Australian Grand Prix, it was a lap down on Newey's McLarens that had obliterated the field, partly due to that second brake pedal. Sir Frank did admit in 2012 that not giving Newey shares was a massive mistake. The cars did score a decent haul of points. It would have been points at every race under today's point system, and Villeneuve did get back-to-back podiums in Germany, where the car was massively disadvantaged power-wise, and also at Hungary. He'd also been running pretty well at Belgium until he became one of the many victims of the weather. Had he stayed on track, he might have had a chance to win the race. Williams would still be third in the Constructors' Championship of 1998, but 38 points versus the 156 and 133 scored by McLaren and Ferrari is light years apart. They were the best of the rest in what was starting to become a very congested mid-pack, as Williams, Jordan and Benetton was separated by just 5 points come the end of the season. So into 1999 things changed up a bit. Frentzen swapped with Ralf Schumacher, who came in from Jordan, while Villeneuve was lured away to British American Racing for the big money deal. Williams, meanwhile, managed to alter the car after learning several lessons through 1998, key among which being a lower centre of gravity and doing some other subtle changes to the car that helped with the overall aero balance. The engine, meanwhile, was still underpowered. 780 horsepower was the best they could get out of what was now a 2-year-old engine, with Mercedes now above 800 horsepower and Ferrari, I'm guessing, around the same. In the second car was Alex Zanardi. Zanardi was in the car because Frank had done a deal with kart team owner Chip Ganassi. The deal was that Williams would get Zanardi because Frank needed an experienced driver, and Zanardi was a 2-time kart champion. In return, Ganassi would get Juan Pablo Montoya. Other teams were after JPM such as Stewart, Minardi and Sauber, but Frank had him locked down on a contract and farmed him out to Ganassi for experience. Ganassi would get Montoya for 3 years and Frank would get Zanardi for 3 years. Win-win. But there was a big problem. Zanardi couldn't get his head around the rock-solid tyres, well, rock-solid compared to kart tyres that were being used in Formula 1, and also the handling characteristics that these tyres brought. On top of this, the front tyres now had 4 grooves cut into them, which is the same as they had in the rear, so it was 4 and 4 instead of 3 and 4 that it was the previous year. Damon Hill also had the same problem, and at the opening round in Australia, Zanardi would crash out. In Brazil, his diff went. His form improved at Imola and was on course for points, but he crashed out of the race when he spun on oil dumped by Johnny Herbert, but then managed to outqualify Ralph by half a second at Monaco. And then his car broke there too. This is basically the story of his season, except for the rain-affected race in France where he ran out of fuel. He was battling Deniz, I think it was, and his radio had broken, so it wasn't entirely his fault. While Ralph was able to accumulate 35 points, which was pretty much Williams' entire haul for the previous year, the competition within the mid-pack had really shown itself. Zanardi didn't score a single point, although under the current point system he would have scored at Monaco, Belgium, Monza and Malaysia. Ralph did get 3 podiums, including a second place in Italy, but Jordan were the third best team that year. Stewart beat Williams by a single point, and Benetton were a bit further back. With this, you have to factor in that only the top 6 scored points, so while the gaps do look big in terms of the actual points scored, their on-track competitiveness was pretty close. Okay, Jordan may be a little bit further in front than the rest of them, but it is what it is. And actually, Schumacher was on course to win at the Nürburgring, but a puncture stopped him from winning that race. Suffice to say, Zanardi was out at the end of the season and Frank needed a stopgap. Enter 20-year-old and actually birthday boy Jenson Button. Montoya was let go by Ganassi at the end of 2000 to join Williams for 2001. At least the livery improved in 1999 as well as the car. A lot more white helped everybody at home differentiate it from the Ferrari, and the red was a little bit brighter too, with the splashes of yellow on the mid part of the side pod, nose, front wing and top of the airbox, and also the blue at the rear allowed it to stand out a bit further. Autosport called the livery peak 90s, especially since Woody Woodpecker's beaky boy face was still there on the nose, and it was something oddly nice and radical for Williams before they lost the tobacco money at the end of 1999, and then went more clean cut with all the tech companies in 2000, as well as the partnership with BMW. Part of that was because Rothmans had been sold to British American Tobacco during the course of 1999, and with British American Racing on the grid, actually owned by British American Tobacco, there wasn't really much reason for BAT to promote a brand on a rival car, if that makes any sense. So I guess Williams was going to lose the tobacco money anyway. Autosport did a whole piece about these red cars for their In Defense Of series, where the writer said his first season was 1999, which makes me feel a bit old. But the livery attached to these two Williams cars serves as one of those things where it's actually really hard to describe. They're almost the symbol of a chaotic time for Williams. And because Williams wasn't as successful in those 2 years as opposed to the 3 or 4 years prior, it makes those red cars be portrayed online as utter monsters that make children cry, women faint, and men vomit. But what I find funny here is that the 99 car was driven by Ralf Schumacher, and one of the sponsors was Brother, the printer making people. So was Ralf driving around with Brother written on the car as a sponsor or as a label? Answers on a postcard. At least the BMW years were a bit more fruitful, but even in that time when Williams had a competitive car and a very good engine, they still had a bit of trouble with red cars. The original red cars, that is. So then, a look at the dismal 2 years Williams had with red cars instead of blue and white ones. If this has been a trip up nostalgia lane, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job, and for more like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on any future videos. Massive thanks as ever to the fine bunch of lads at Patreon for the support, and if you want to help keep the picture purchasing piggy bank topped up, then a link to Patreon is down in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and bobs. Or the super thanks if you just want to do a one and done tip. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.